Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. My name is Pat Murphy. I'm Head of Environment Knowledge Transfer with Teagasc, and the Signpost series is brought to you by Teagasc in association with Food Drink Ireland Skillnet, National Rural Network, and Dairy Sustainability Ireland. This morning, I'm joined by Padraig Foley to help with the questions. Padraig, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much, Pat. Morning, everyone.
Hi, and we're joined this morning by Dr. Douglas McMillan and by Eimhin Shortt. If you throw on your video there and unmute yourselves. This morning, our topic is the story of our bogs, and our bogs play a surprisingly large role in our carbon story and will be doing going forward. I think it's I suppose a relatively unknown part of the story. Douglas?
Yeah, just Pat is telling me that the host has disabled the camera, so okay. I can't start it. So I don't know if it's on. Okay, well, we'll try and get that. We'll continue conversing and try and get that sorted and see what's happening there. Okay, we have you. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you.
So, as I was saying, the bogs are going to play a huge part in the story of our carbon journey over the next while. You might give us an idea of the extent to which we are getting carbon or emitting carbon at the moment from our bogs.
Yeah, well, I think the conservative estimate is there's at least 10 million tons of CO2 coming from our bogs. It's probably higher, but that's the kind of figure, and there's a lot of monitoring to be done to get a more precise figure. That's
so a lot of change required and a lot of intention to change. Eimhin, you're involved in the Farm Carbon project as project coordinator. You might just give us a quick indication of what's involved in that project.
Yeah, so Farm Carbon is looking at peat soil regeneration, peat soil rewetting there in the 3 catchments of the Silver River, the Camcur and the Little Brosna. So it's a catchment focused program. The intention is the delivery, or the task is the delivery of a payment for results scheme for peat soils in Ireland, peat soils under agricultural management. So as Doug was mentioning, 10 million tons of that, 8 million tons are from transited from drained peat grasslands, basically. So that's the core focus of the program.
There's potential for reduction, but there's also a potential for income to be generated by those reductions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, most definitely. Yeah. So in the context of the carbon farming scheme, this is what we'll be looking at. It's an additional incentive structure to be added on top of CAP subsidy payments to farmers through this program, which will be rolled out European wide. We'll get to it a little later on.
Okay. Well, this is I suppose the first time we're dealing with our bogs in the Signpost series. So I think you're going to start with the story of our bogs, Douglas. So it should be fascinating. So you want to take it away there?
Okay, if that's coming up.
Yes, perfect.
Good, brilliant. Okay, so just thanks very much for that, Pat. I'm presenting this. What's the story of Bogs? As you said, it's the first time you're covering it. So I've got quite a lot in there. I'm trying to pack it in, so I'll try and get it on time, if that's okay. But if I can get a little bit of leeway, that'd be brilliant. So just to move on. That's just our partners on the program that Eimhin was just mentioning. We have the 2 main projects we're working on. We're working on restoration of actual bogs in Mayo, and then we have the Farm Carbon project in and around Offaly. So just a little bit about Green Restoration Ireland Cooperative. So we set up back in 2019, so a member of the Irish Cooperative Organisation Society, and we set up with the intention of supporting rural development through actions, including preparation for offsetting, to restore a natural landscape. And our focus is practical, community-orientated solutions based on scientific data, because that's my background. So this is one of the frogs from our bogs. So getting onto what is peat, back onto the subject matter. So peat is essentially in waterlogged environments where the plant material dies, it's only partially decomposed because of the wet and the anoxic conditions. So what happens is, season over season, this will accumulate and pile on top of each other, and then as more accumulation takes place, it gets compacted. But the key thing in relation to peat is water. It's all about the water. So where you have a waterlogged bog like that, you have about 90%. If you ever walked on a healthy bog, you'd be walking on it and it will actually ripple as you're walking across it. So here we have a sphagnum cuspidatum pool in the bottom left. That will be very wet. And then of course to harvest it, you need to dry it sufficiently that you can cut it and dry it out. So this is what we're looking at in the top right of the screen. Just I wanted to comment, sorry, I think in the description of the title there was an error. I had put in that it's a too high a figure. I hadn't accounted for the 15% of our boglands that are owned by Coillte. So it's about 77%, well, by default, based on how much Bord na Móna has, which is about 5% of the total. Parks and Wildlife have about 3%, Coillte have 15%. By default, that would leave about 75, 77% in the hands of farmers and landowners. And overall, we have about 1.5 million hectares of peatlands, or 21% of the land area of the country. In terms of the condition that they're in, you have about 17% would be natural or near natural in relatively good conditions, so as they would have been originally. Cut over bog accounts for about 39% of the total. About 19% is afforested, and then about 19% is the part that we were discussing where it's been converted from peatland to pasture, so it's being grazed for various for dairy or for beef. So overall, we're looking at about 1.2 million hectares of degraded peatlands, which is over 80% of the total. So a lot of work to do in terms of turning that around, as we were saying, about 10 million tons being emitted from that on an annual basis at a conservative estimate. So in terms of carbon, it's all the rage at the moment. So very timely that we're talking about this. So how much are we talking about? Well, again, an estimate is that there's about 1.5 billion tons of carbon stored in the Irish bogs, which will constitute about 53% of the soil, of the total organic carbon, soil organic carbon, on about 20% of the land area. And just for comparative purposes, that'll be about 4 to 5 times what we have in our woodlands. So that's a lot. So it's reasonable to ask why. Particularly as bogs are very low productivity. Essentially, raised bogs will be dependent on the nutrition from the rainfall, which is virtually none. It's also very weather dependent. So in a dry year, you might actually have bogs emitting more greenhouse gases than they sequester. But a healthy bog generally would sequester between about 0.5 and 2 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. So it's not very productive compared to forests and maybe grasslands, but the fact is, because it can continue accumulating on top of itself, it can keep doing that over thousands of years. And this is what has happened. Just a question there. So how much in about 2 meters or more of peat, you'd be talking about, if you have a certain depth of peat, 10, 15 centimeters, there'd be as much carbon in that as there would be in a mature spruce woodland, yield class 16. So you're talking about 1,000 tons of carbon plus if you do the maths and multiply it up for the 2 meters depth of peat, or more or less about 20 times what you'd have, the amount of carbon you'd have in a similar land area of forest. So a lot. And just to give you a visual there, as you can see, this little small bit of peat in the middle of all of that forest stores more carbon than all of that forest put together. So that's the scale of things. Just to go a little bit further, so if we say some of our bogs, the raised bogs in particular, if they haven't been cut away too much, or if they're still intact, they're going to be more than 4 meters in depth. So there'll be 2,000 tons or more per hectare, and that will be equivalent, just to give you an idea of the scale. And you can see the little small man there at the foot of quite a small redwood. That would be equivalent to or more than the giant redwood forest in California. So just next time you're looking at the little scraggy bit of bodland, if that was a woodland, that would actually be potentially towering above you into the sky, 100 meters or more. And we have actually found fields which would constitute that amount of carbon. Just while we're making the comparison between the trees and the boglands, it might be relevant to ask the question, do they go together? So again, just as a reminder, about 19% are afforested. But again, as I said, it's all about the water. So if the water goes out, then the oxygen comes in and the peat degrades and it releases CO2 into the atmosphere, and it will release dissolved organic carbon into the waterways. So obviously, as part of the preparation for forestry, it's ditched, it's drained. And in addition, the trees will act as giant wicks. Through their respiratory processes, they will evapotranspire thousands of gallons of water per year. So they will further accelerate the drying process. thereby accelerating the decomposition of the peat. So they don't really go. In terms of some of the emission rates, so it's all about ranges. You have to measure specifically to get the exact area, which is quite tricky. So in terms of farm peatlands, maybe 8 to 20 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year would be released, so 3 to 8 million tons. And a forested peatlands, according to some studies, would release up to four more tons, in excess of the carbon that would be getting sequestered into the trees. So quite a lot. Just in terms of some of the solutions that we're looking at in Green Restoration Ireland, we see a combination of the results-based payment development, that approach that we're working on as part of the Farm Carbon EIP in the Midlands, and offsetting. So I just wanted to touch on those briefly. So again, obviously there's the pre-existing EIPs, so Hen Harrier, Bride, Pearl Mussel, Farm Peat would be our sister project in the Midlands. They're doing a lot, they've done a lot of good work in relation to peatland restoration, so they're already leading the charge. This is our logo in the top right-hand side, so Farm Carbon. And again, I'm sure for those of you that have been listening to the series, you're familiar with them. So results-based payment schemes, it's essentially payment for the good quality habitat and then improvement, and you get paid for that. The difference with us is that we're doing before and after. So we've been measuring the baseline, and then our aim is to implement the mitigation measure and see what the actual quantitative impact is in terms of reduced greenhouse gases and so on. We're also looking at new technologies, analytical approaches, and farmer-friendly technologies in the midterm. Offsetting then is the key thing we started with. There's different types. So we have the one in the Holland Green Deal. They don't have any peatlands left there. So it's essentially about regulating water levels on peaty fields, more futures, peatland code, and so on. So just a few things to clarify in relation to this. So offsetting principles. First of all, I think I've seen some of the articles, there's a bit of confusion. There's a voluntary and there's the emission trading scheme, which is mandatory. So offsetting is a voluntary thing. It's a company maybe it's done its best in terms of reducing its CO2 emissions, but it still has offsets, that it still has emissions that would like to offset with a suitable project. A few other principles. So baseline scenario, the thing is, what will happen if the bog is left, let's say the abandoned bog with the drain still in it, which is bleeding out the water, is left in place, what will happen? And we'll see in the next couple of slides. Another thing is additionality. So again, you can't plant a field with grants, so say government grants, and then say, oh, I'll get some carbon offsets. That's not additional. That was going to happen anyway. So it's the money from the offsetting that pays for the work to be done. Leakage is another issue as well. So you can't deprive, let's say, remove access to a resource, let's say turf cutting, and then it's transferred to another area. That would be something to consider. Permanence also. Similarly, no point putting a lot of effort into a project if all those trees are going to be cut down or the bog is going to be drained at some time in the future. So they have to be permanent. And then lastly, there's the requirement for monitoring, reporting, and verification. So that would involve doing follow-up. So first of all, the verification by a third party to confirm that your project is legitimate, and then the monitoring that's carried out subsequently to confirm that you have achieved the re-wetting and the restoration of the bog. Just the baseline for what would happen to the peatlands if they were left alone. Well, as I said, it's like a sponge, it's drained, it will oxidize. So how much will it shrink by? Well, we have a good idea. This is, if you're a bit of an ecology nerd, you'll be familiar with this Hom Fen post in Whittlesea Mere. The landowner at the time fancied that bogs were sponges, and he wanted to see what would happen as he was draining it. So he put this post in place. The top of the post is where the bog used to be, and what's happened is it's oxidized its way down to the groundwater, the groundwater level, and it stopped oxidizing. So that's 22 feet down to 8 feet. So that's what will happen to all bogs if they're not re-wetted. Similarly, in the future, again, we see more and more fires. So as things warm up, a dry bog is essentially a big tinderbox. So as we have that burning will release very significant levels of CO2. And once it's badly burned, it's very hard to restore. In terms of the approach that's used in relation to this, what we're looking to, as I said, we started off in Mayo and we were looking at using the existing peatland code. It's climatically, it's similar but not the same as Ireland. Ultimately, we want to do a peatland code for Ireland, a wetland code. But essentially the principle is simple. If you are monitoring, as I said, a peatland, it would cost you a fortune. So what you do is you identify the vegetation type let's say sphagnum or heather or what have you. And based on measurements that have been done on other sites, you correlate that, you map the area out and say, this is degraded, this is partially degraded, this is healthy. And you can determine how much is being emitted from each different block of the site. And in relation to greenhouse gases, it's not what's being sequestered, although ultimately if it's successful, there would be a small amount sequestered on an annual basis. It's what's avoided. So again, I make the point that when you're buying trees as carbon offsets, it's future selling. You are planting trees on this land and saying in 100 years time or 50 years time, there will be X tons of carbon. With bogs, it's back selling because the carbon is there, you're just locking it in. So it's a safer bet, essentially. Just a few other key things. It's got to be credible for methodology, robust, practical, repeatable, and so on, based on an understanding of those processes. So we want to adapt that process for the other existing codes in Europe and the UK. Just very quickly here, you can see on the left-hand side, you have the intact bog, and you have this classic hummock hollow lawn microtopography. That would be a healthy bog. That would be sequestering, as I said, 1/2 to 2 tons of CO2 carbon per hectare per year. Then as it's drained, the draining process starts, that collapses back. So you have a kind of homogeneous surface. And that would be emitting CO2. And then as it gets drier and drier, the vegetation changes until you have a kind of a heath type vegetation. And just an indication here. So intact, based on the peatland code, you'd have about 1 ton of emissions per year, moderately degraded 2.5, within a certain distance would drain 4. And then if it's bare peat, it will be up to 24 tons. This is just the method that's used by the Dutch. As I said, this is basically a graph illustrating that as you raise the water table level in the level of the water in the ditch, so the level of CO2 emissions declines. Just 2 days ago, we had a very seminal event. We did our first re-wet. Tommy McGovern is the owner up there. Lacadoff is one of our members in the ditches. So we actually started our first wet based on this approach. So that was great to see. It's only been a couple of years in the making. So it was quite something for me anyway. Other issues in ecosystem services. Decomposing peat, as I said, as the peat degrades, it's either majority into the air as CO2, but also a certain proportion as dissolved organic carbon going into the waterways. And the ranges, as you can see, it's about 0.17 to 0.26 tons per hectare per year of dissolved organic carbon. Nutrients also, so there'll be a certain amount of ammonia, nitrates, very little phosphate, but that will also be going into the waterways. And then, of course, if it's a bare peat surface, that will be getting washed into the rivers and add in a nutrient load there. And you'll be familiar with the brown coloration of the bog that comes from the iron complexes in the peat drainage water. Flow control, so again, a healthy bog will act as a giant sponge, and it will absorb excess rainwater and release it steadily. But once it's cut open, obviously that will then release it very readily, so it adds to flood events. So a healthy bog is a much more effective water store. And a lot of the natural flood control methods in the UK are now based on restoring boglands as a key method of holding the water, excess rainfall up in the uplands. Biodiversity, just very quickly, we have about 50% of the remaining raised bog in Western Europe. So we have a very important amount of that. And I think it's about 20% of global blanket bogs. So we have a very significant complement of very rare and valuable habitats. Fens as well would be very rare, and would also be very rarest type of peatland, and that's what we hope to be regenerating maybe as part of our work in the Midlands. And then we also have all of those rare species that are associated with boglands, lap and wetlands, corncrake, curlew, lapwing, marsh fritillary, which is in the back of my screensaver here, as you can see. Just a few possible solutions that we're going to be using to control greenhouse gas emissions as part of the Farm Carbon project in the Midlands. If we were going to address the emissions, some kind of rehydration is going to be involved. So we haven't done it yet, so I can't speak too much about it. Once we've done, hopefully we'll be able to come back and give you chapter and verse on it. But essentially the options, as far as we can see for the moment, is re-wet and let it rewild. Again, if it was kind of marginal lands, marginal grazing lands, that wouldn't be too much of an issue. If it's good grazing, maybe the partial re-wetting, as per the Dutch approach, would be a potential solution. Or alternatively, I think this is very interesting. We have our partners in Germany who Typhotechnic, and there are many other types of polluted culture or wet agricultural crops that would be available. So in this instance, you kind of have your cake and eat it. You can re-wet the field, lock in the CO2, and then grow a crop which will sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And then in the case of cattails, it can be used as a sustainable building material. And according to the figures we're given, it's very lucrative. Again, I believe things when I see them, but look, we have to try them and find alternatives here. So that's that. Lastly, just to finish, one of the questions I think a lot of farmers have is if a peaty field is re-wetted, what's going to happen to the field next to it that mightn't be peaty? So from that perspective, we're also going to be looking at the adjacent lands from the point of view of regenerative agriculture. So a ryegrass monoculture has very poor water infiltration capacity. So there's the standard approach is multi-species swards, mob grazing, and so on, which would increase the capacity of those lands to absorb additional water and maintain grazing over a long period of the year. Okay, that was it. I don't know, no idea how I did on timing there, Pat. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay.
Was I on song?
You're fine. We're reasonably flexible anyway. So if we can move on to Evan.
Brilliant. Thank you.
No problem. That was fascinating insight. Evan, you'll need to unmute yourself there.
Yeah, great. Okay. So
we have that now.
You have that. Great. I'll get straight to it. Let's move this out of the way. Okay, so thanks very much, Doug. That was a great presentation. This will get into the policy dimensions of the carbon farming initiative at European policy level. So comparatively dry by comparison, but there you go. We'll move straight into it. So you see here that the European Union are to launch their carbon farming framework by the end of 2021. This publication is from AgFunder. It's a global blog for investors in the agricultural space. And you see that they've used pictures there from Connemara and have noted that the extraction from Europe's vast beet fields is a significant component of the European Carbon Farming Initiative. So my slides don't, oh yeah, okay, there we go. So why carbon farming? So carbon farming and regenerative agriculture can restore functional ecosystems. They can mitigate against climate change effects. They can protect from drought, improve water quality, attenuate flooding, and restore biodiversity, can create healthy and sustainable communities in the process. So at national level, it's important to remember that while we're decarbonizing our energy and transport sectors, we should also be recarbonizing our landscapes and building healthy and resilient soil biology, vegetation, woodland cover, and biodiversity to return atmospheric carbon to its natural cycle in living terrestrial systems. So what is carbon farming? Well, carbon farming is an integrated green business model for agriculture that can create new income streams for rural communities while making landscapes and bioregions more resilient to climate change. So in terms of how it works, it's working as a conjunction between payment for result schemes on the one hand, and also in the context of the carbon markets. So as Dr. McMillan has mentioned there earlier, you have two types of carbon markets. You've got the ETS, which is mandatory, the European trading scheme, and then the voluntary carbon markets, which are operated and managed by the UN at a global level, which are voluntary and project-led. So you can see here an older framing from the context of the carbon markets indicated by the blue arrow that says that a project that reduces greenhouse gas emissions can generate carbon credits that are certified under the Kyoto Protocol or voluntary standards. Now, this is one way, and of course, peatland rewetting is reducing future emissions. Then the alternative, and especially important to the regenerative agricultural canon, is the sequestration of carbon at a measurable rate and the processing of this by methodology into what is called a verified carbon unit. So verified carbon units are created by the application of specific methodologies to land practices. And then the application of what we've looked at earlier, the monitoring results and verification method. What are the drivers then at a European policy level? Well, the main driver at European policy level is, of course, LULUCF, the land use change and forestry regulation that came into effect in 2014. So the LULUCF regulation mandates that greenhouse gas emissions do not exceed removals in the land use sector. So whatever in terms of nitrous oxide, methane, carbon emission is coming off of the land, the same that will be measured according to the LULUCF accountancy framework, and the same must be coming back in by virtue of sequestration. So this is happening within the land use sector, which means that the emissions from the land use sector have to be brought back in through sequestration or removal in that same sector, known as the no debit rule. And it should be noted that the scope of the LULUCF regulation is extended from forestry, where it was created initially, to all land uses, including agriculture, and that by 2026, LULUCF will include accountancy for managed wetlands. So here's a quote from the Vice President for the European Green Deal, Frans Timmermans, who says that our climate action must first and foremost produce human-made emissions, but we also need to restore and protect natural carbon sinks so that we can capture CO2 from the atmosphere and store it in our soils and forests. Carbon farming offers new income opportunities for farmers. It is an example of how the new Common Agricultural Policy's eco-schemes and private funding can reward agricultural practices that help us fight the climate and biodiversity crises. So it should be noted that pilot projects are to be rolled out for carbon farming at national and partner member state levels across the European Union from 2023. These pilot projects will be co-funded through the European LIFE programme and the European Agricultural and Regional Development Funds. On that basis, I should note also that there is a workshop hosted by the DECC next Wednesday, bid proposal writing workshop with Deloitte for the LIFE program specifically, if people are interested in pursuing that. Recommendations from the Climate Change Advisory Council in their annual review in 2020 suggested specific policy innovation to encourage and enable higher rates of afforestation and improved management of high carbon soils. This includes peatlands, of course. The Council recommends that the role of farmers in the management of carbon stocks be acknowledged and that farmers should be incentivized to adopt measurable and verifiable practices that sequester carbon. The Council recommends positive, constructive engagement with the European Farm to Fork strategy and other to help achieve both greenhouse gas emissions reduction and other environmental benefits, such as improved water quality. And the government should introduce measures to significantly reduce nitrogen use by 2030. So of course, carbon farming, regenerative agriculture, they have these attendant benefits of increasing the soil organic carbon stock. This increases water infiltration and holding capacity on lands. And then by application of multi-species swards, Teagasc have published research, of course, that show a 50% reduction in nitrogen application on those lands, all of which can be used in the context of this particular program. So you can see here that the Carbon Farming Initiative was set in place in April of this year, and we should note that Farm Carbon was launched in March of this year, having been notified of the award in February. So we're slightly ahead of the curve here, which is good for Ireland. We've got the best foot forward, and we have contributed throughout the two-year programme of the European Roundtable on Carbon Farming. And so we're well placed to establish a national pilot here. So the first legal proposal on the Carbon Farming Initiative will be launched by the end of 2021. And an attendant carbon removal certification mechanism has been announced in the Circular Economy Action Plan, due to be presented in 2023. And so our program is 2 years. The 2-year baseline will assess conditions according to various practices at baseline level. And then through implementation, we will look at the results, of course, for things like agroforestry, peatland rewetting, mineral soil regeneration, and livestock carbon auditing. Long-term changes have to be assessed, and that, of course, won't be possible within the 2-year program. But as this initiative shows, we will be extending our activities beyond the life cycle. That is the intention. So these are the 4 pillars of carbon farming. So the question then is, what are we doing about it at Green Restoration Ireland? Well, as Dr. McMillan has mentioned, we are a cooperative. We are looking at blending local approaches to emissions reduction with the land use and land management sector, with agriculture, by partnering community approaches with business and schemes of this nature to reduce carbon emissions in verifiable ways. So how are we going about doing that? Well, on the Farm Carbon project, as mentioned previously, we'll be assessing baselines, implementing regenerative agricultural practices and restoration of peatlands, measuring the outcomes, developing payment for results schemes according to these, and monitoring results and verification schemas. Additionally, we're also looking at landscape scale sustainability planning frameworks. We're working together with Vera and their program Landscale, which looks at all of the producers in a region, together with the forward planning of these producers, such that you declimate risk production within the landscape, and also that is used then according to economic, social, and governance vectors to de-risk to de-risk investment within those regions also. In addition, we're also working to create incentive structures for regenerative agricultural transition and the valuation and payment for the secondary production of ecosystem co-benefits. And so we're used to the phrase of primary production in agriculture, and it's quite interesting to see this concept of secondary production enter the field. So the valuation of ecosystem co-benefits, ecosystem services, the improvements to biodiversity, air quality, water quality, soil organic carbon, and so on, and the valuation of these, their measurement, and the making of payments based on these. And so that's that's the core focus of our work at Green Restoration and at Farm Carbon. Here you will see in blue from the technical document published by the European Union on the Carbon Farming Initiative, suggestions as to the nature of the types of program that can be applied, or the types of measures that can be applied. And below in black, in the next 3 slides, some of the things that we're doing at Farm Carbon to illustrate how we're following this program. So in terms of depleted arable land, we are partnering with Trees on the Land, who have an EIP to investigate silvo-arable methods, so the blending of tree systems with arable systems. And we're going to be coordinating in terms of baseline assessment and metric design for that system as part of our contribution to a national carbon farming initiative pilot. In terms of the planting of new forests and the restoration of degraded forests, the improvement of management of existing forests, we have measures within our program that include riparian woodland buffers, native woodland development, orchards, and agroforestry. And speakers from last week's webinar series, Eugene Kern and Eimhin Shortt, are members of our advisory committee there, and we look forward to developing that relationship with them. In terms of supplying biomass for the production of long-lasting bio-based products, as Dr. McMillan mentioned earlier on, in partnership with the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, we will be trialing paludiculture or wet agriculture in preparation for the production of insulated panel boarding from reeds, rushes, wetland cropping systems, and so on. These same substrates can be used in the development of alternatives to horticultural peat and alternatives to peat-based animal beddings. So then also in the protection of carbon-rich soils, such as grasslands and peatlands. Of course, as mentioned previously, drained peat soils in Ireland are the single largest land use emission at an estimated 8 megatons of carbon dioxide per annum. So the primary focus of the Farm Carbon EIP is the delivery of a payment for results scheme to incentivize and accelerate peat soil rewetting in Ireland. Now, in terms of where people can find more information on this policy piece and the directions as to how to go about building pilots in this, you will find on the EU publications website the technical document on setting up and implementing results-based carbon farming mechanisms in the EU. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for having us along here. And for more information, you can contact us at eip@farmcarbon.ie. Thanks very much.
Just stop sharing there. Okay, that was a lot in a very short space of time. Just remind people that if you post your questions in relation to the talks on the question and answers, and we'll get to them. I suppose one of the questions I have is you're in this project, you're bringing farmers in who are operating on drain peat in particular. What's the project going to look like from their perspective? What are they going to be asked to do? And I suppose a follow-on question from that is, how does the economics of it look like to those farmers vis-a-vis what they're doing at the moment is probably grazing animals in relatively difficult land to farm? You're on mute, Douglas.
So I'll field this on you, probably you'll get the next one, Evan. Just in terms of what we're asking them to do, we will be doing a whole farm survey, and we will be essentially offering them a list of measures. We will be providing them with information about what that would entail, and then they'll be selecting what they want to do. So in terms of the peaty fields, if you like, as I indicated, it'll be a re-wet and rewilding, partial re-wetting, or alternative crops, as far as we see it. And then in terms of the economics, we have a farm accountant as part of that, and we aim to look at that. But I think it hasn't been done before here, so we can't really elaborate. It's just kind of going to get stuck in. We're going to do it. We're going to monitor everything, record everything, and see what the results are. And the farmers will be compensated for being the guinea pigs, if you like, in terms of doing this. So I couldn't really elaborate any further on that. If you have something to add, Evan, on that.
Sorry, I've been looking at the questions in the Q&A.
No, we're just in terms of, I suppose, the economics of the potential for, I suppose, earning income from the various components and the various outputs that you're talking about vis-a-vis what's happening on the farms at the moment.
Yes, so a drained peat field can emit anywhere between 8 and 20 tons of carbon dioxide per annum. So at the upper limit, that's about in the region of €1,000 per hectare. And so when you re-wet a field, you will have to change the grazing management practice on that field. There might be a reduction in the grazing. And we have measures in the program to accommodate that, and training programs in and around changes in grazing. So that aspect will be looked at. We're also working with a farm accountant throughout the program who will be working closely with the farmers. We do not intend, of course, to cost anybody anything. The intention is to benefit all farmers on the program economically, while benefiting the biodiversity and ecological condition of the farms. But with what we've looked at so far, the indications are that this can be quite lucrative for farmers, by contrast with certain uses for their lands. Yeah.
Okay. Padraig, huge number of questions flying in.
Yeah, and lots of variety in them as well. The first one I'm going to ask is, are you measuring methane production from re-wetted peatlands also? There was no mention of methane in the presentations.
So I think Evan had touched on that. Well, maybe because we have perhaps you can elaborate on that, Evan. He mentioned that we will have 3 eddy covariance towers, so perhaps I'll let you elaborate on there, Evan.
Sure, yeah. So in the Farm Carbon program, we're working with Gary Lanigan from the Soil Carbon Observatory. And so 3 of the Signpost farms will be based within our program, and the control, I believe, will be at Gerteen, whereby the gaseous emissions from the lands will be measured over the life cycle of the program, with a view to building out appropriate MRV for that aspect. Now, the current research is that the long-term gain in terms of carbon emission or avoided carbon emission is far outweighed by the methane production in the re-wetting process. Also, methane is on the short cycle, while carbon is a long cycle in terms of the emission of carbon dioxide enters the upper atmosphere, and it takes quite some time. Methane is quite a shorter cycle and has more potential to be reabsorbed into the system at the ground level. So I can't say too much more on it than that.
Yeah. So the towers will measure all of that gas flux, just to answer the question, Padraig. So that will be monitoring both the CO2 and the methane emissions, and will give us an overall picture from the sites that they'll be installed upon.
A work in progress. Watch this space. Okay, so currently farmers are receiving a one-off payment of €1,000 for every hectare of woodland from private corporations, and a company can reap the benefits. So this is kind of a common theme that's coming through, is once the credits are sold, can they be sold again, or is there... Actually, another question that kind of ties in with that is, if agriculture sells those emissions, can agriculture still reap the reward and the reduction that's coming from those emissions?
I think I suppose one of the key things is that you can't sell the same offset twice. That's double counting. So that's kind of into scam territory. So that if you were selling like a plot of an avoided emissions, but then also I think the carbon farming document talks about a combination of public and private sector. So it is actually proposing that combination of maybe the payments and/or. Now, what that will look like, as you said just a second ago, Padraig, is watch this space. But that's what we're envisaging and hoping will be the case.
Yeah, and do you see it something that might continue, that big business will offset carbon credits or offset their carbon emissions via agriculture by paying farmers to do so?
Yeah, well, we have just such company for our projects in Mayo, so we have an interest, and the key thing is to do something. We want to have a case study and see how it works out. So if that goes well, then we hope that will be the first of many. But there's a lot of interest, and in particular, I think what we've seen with all of the forest fires is, planting a woodland isn't necessarily a good bet. I'd say there's quite a few carbon offsets that have gone up in smoke over the last few months in various countries. So bogland re-wetted is much more resilient. And as I said, the carbon is already there. You're just locking it in.
Okay, again, kind of on the same theme, from a tillage perspective, there's a lot of carbon capture actions taking place on farms, of straw incorporation and cover crops and so on. When do you guys think that farmers will get the monetary benefit of that carbon capture?
Well, first of all, baselines have to be assessed for any future carbon units to be generated. They can only be generated against measured baselines. And so far at Irish, like in Ireland, there's no nationally led program to develop this. There are the beginnings of it, of course, in the Soil Carbon Observatory, and then as launched last week, the National soil sampling pilot, which we would encourage farmers to engage in. This is also the beginnings of developing a set of baseline scenarios such that projects of the nature that we're looking at can be developed. But until those baselines are assessed, it's very difficult for farmers to turn gains into carbon units and therefore economic benefit to themselves.
Just to add to that, as part of the project, we are actually trying to develop a rapid device for measuring soil organic carbon, what we call a soil organic carbon infrared transition tool. So we're hoping that will be one of the outputs. As I mentioned, we're developing technologies in this area. So again, that would really facilitate that. As Evan was saying, we need the baselines, but that can be expensive and so on. So the idea here with this instrument, if it should work, You'll be able to rapidly measure that. Then subsequent to doing whatever the improvement measures are, you will be able to measure what the additional carbon sequestration is that has occurred. And then of course you can get that money, because at the moment, because it's tricky to do, that's kind of the side of the carbon offsetting business that isn't touched. It's all above ground. The below ground stuff, they don't go near it because it's too much hassle.
Okay, a lot of questions here on the Common Agricultural Policy and the incorporation of what you guys have discussed and presented being part of the next CAP. Has there been any consultation, or are there any plans in that space?
In terms of in Ireland?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think there were multiple comments made by the department and ministers over the course of the last 2 weeks. So I think the minister's position is that there's no national program to be developed. Now, that statement is quite interesting, because on the one hand, if you don't regulate it, then it's open for voluntary carbon market participation. That's one thing. Then on the second hand, the European Union are developing a carbon farming initiative. So technically the Irish government can take part in that. Why would it develop its own? Yet at the same time, the Irish government could very well lend its energies to developing, with the National Standards Association Ireland, ISO standard methodologies for the various practices involved in the carbon farming initiative, such that the sector can move ahead. We're one project, and we're doing our bit with peatland rewetting in the first instance, but there's plenty of work to be done in this space. It would be interesting to see more energy coming into it from policy and department levels.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say that's a very complex subject at the moment, and with probably not a huge pile of clarity as to exactly where it's going. There's a few questions there in relation to forestry. You mentioned agroforestry and potential for forestry in these areas. Could you maybe elaborate on what your thinking is in relation to the role of forestry, which is there's sometimes controversy in relation to forestry and peatland. So what do you see as the potential role in terms of the protecting of carbon within our and the mitigating of losses?
Doug, do you want to take that one? I can come in after you, Doug, if you want to go ahead.
I'm very sorry, Pat. I was actually busy. I thought that sounded more like Evan's question, so I was reading very interesting queries on that, and I wanted to come to them if that was possible. So I'm very sorry. I wasn't.
You are no, just in terms of you mentioned the potential role of forestry in this whole project, and I suppose it can be controversial, the planting of forests on peatland. And I'm just wondering where you see that potentially going. Is it a particular type of forestry? Is it agroforestry, or is there much of a role there?
I think it's definitely a big issue, and it's a big with the current planting on peatlands it's kind of counterproductive in a lot of ways. So it's definitely something that needs to be reviewed. We are hoping to look at it, but I haven't really had much time to delve into it yet. But yeah, definitely that is an issue. And for example, one of the farms we were looking at, they're actually planted forestry, and we were depthing the field, the peat, and we ran out of probes. So it was over 8 meters deep of peat with forestry, which is ridiculous. You know, that is not what we should be doing. But then I suppose in other ones where maybe it's some kind of re-wetting, and as you were suggesting there, Pat, maybe trees, alder and willow, again, we have to research this area. So we haven't covered that yet.
Okay.
Just when you mentioned re-wetting, Douglas, sorry, go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, just in terms of planted deep peat is a major question. You know, you'll be aware at Teagasc that there was research published in the last 3 months that has re-estimated the emissions factor from planted peat. It's 3 times higher than formerly assessed, and this places planted deep peat as a net emitter. And therefore, close attention should be paid, because managed wetland, when it comes in 2026 to the LULUCF accountancy framework, there will be close attention paid, and there will be a significant cost to the state for the emissions from this sector. We did mention 8 million tonnes from the transition grasslands earlier. That's working out at in the region of over €500 million per annum at current prices, and those prices are not going down. So that's very important to look at. Planted deep peat is also very important to look at, especially with regard to the mandate to replant. So where you have a non-performing forestry plantation on deep peat, there is a logic to looking at the felling of it and then the re-wetting, as opposed to, we'll know that these things tend to take significant time, but there's not a lot of time to turn this around, and so it doesn't need to be looked at quite quickly. Then in the wider dimension of the carbon farming initiative, what are the functions of forestry? Well, it's been found that 15 to 20 meter buffer of riparian woodland planted along the bankside will catch 95% of agricultural runoff before it hits the watercourse. So you get the carbon from the trees, you get the increased soil carbon buildup as a result of the root system of those trees also, and the attendant microbiology, excuse me. And also you get the improvement, the co-benefit of the improvement to the water course. So we'll be working with the agricultural catchment program to assess measures such as these in our own program. Then of course there's the silvopasture and silvo-arable, as were mentioned by Eugene and Eamon last week, that will be looked at over the course of our program. So there's a variety of dimensions to that question there with regard on-farm trees.
Both of you actually mentioned re-wetting in both of your answers, and just one comment here in relation to drain blocking may actually sometimes cause drying of adjacent land, and is that going to be measured or accounted? And I'll just combine with that, there's another comment / question around this, a similar topic, that farmers would expect the land that they already have and the hedgerows that they already have and the carbon that's already a part of their farm to be accounted for with carbon credits. Just make a comment on both of those, please.
Absolutely, that would be our view on those things. Just could I? Yeah, no, that I would absolutely. That's what we're in favour of. I don't know. Sorry, I don't know if I. What was? Yeah,
no, you're hitting the nail on the head. Yeah.
Is that it? I mean, what's the
re-wetting then is another one as regards if you're re-wetting one, is it going to drain land beside it? The water is coming from somewhere.
Well, again, I said I like a healthy bog will actually hold and release water steadily. As I said, where it's cut, it's bleeding. You know, when you get excess rain, it will just, you get peak flood events, whereas actually it's a big sponge, and like a woodland, similarly, it will actually release it over a period of time. So that shouldn't be happening. Again, obviously, I'm sure there may be circumstances in which it does happen, and we'll have to look at those individually, but generally that's not how it would react. Could I just make a comment there, Padraig, on one of the things? Just what somebody was saying about the comment on the negative words, degraded, moderately degraded. That wasn't my terminology. So as I said, we are aiming to do like an Irish version, and it was saying you suggested more positive terms, which I think is a great idea. But also it isn't, and it's saying it promotes helplessness. It is actually easy, and that's the point. We want to have examples where it's done, and then you can come and see. And it isn't that complex. It's kind of reversing the process of what was done previously. But I think that's a great idea. And can I continue? Or?
You can, of course. Yeah,
this
might be quicker because there's lots of questions there. So
sure. So just on the additionality, there was the question there. So the key thing is that, you know, if you're getting the money for the offsetting, you can't have done it yourself already. So if you put a wind farm anyway and you're getting the money, you can't then go and look for credits for the wind farm. It's the same thing with the re-wettings. The point is that you wouldn't be doing it, and that's obviously the case with a lot of boglands. No one's going to go back and block the drains up unless they get some kind of funding to do that. So that's the additionality. And that's one of the key issues of the carbon credit industry. And one of the other questions was, will this be for carbon credits? Absolutely. That's what we're trying to start a process whereby we have baseline projects and with the view to having verified carbon credits in the future for sale. And of course, that increases the value. Once they're verified by the third party, now that adds value to them and you can get a better price. So that would be an important way of reaping more benefit from carrying out those actions.
Do you want to comment on the biochar while you're in that section?
Biochar, we have a lot going on, a lot of moving parts in the project, but yeah, we'd love to do that. Evan's done quite a bit of research into that area, but I think what we have to do is be reasonable. We have so many resources, but what we'll be looking to do is to pull in other projects with other partners. As we're looking also, we'll be looking at micro and fungi degradation of peat soils. We'll be looking to pull in other research work around that. So that's absolutely the objective, to investigate all of those different opportunities. But we'll have to get more resources for that.
So the question
you might mention Apori, Doug. Apori is, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's it. I'm doing all the talking. Far ahead, man.
Oh, no. Well, Lopori is one of our a doctoral student who will be working with us throughout the course of the program, and he's worked extensively with biochar in agroecological production systems. He's done a very wide range of research, and so there's a lot of interest in the use of biochar, say, because biochar would stop butyric acid formation. It reduces ammonia emission and so on from slurry tanks and the like. And so there's as part of our whole farm planning, we will be looking at site-specific measures and implementation dependent upon the particular conditions of those farms. So a certain farm might have reduced slurry storage or might need to deal with these kinds of issues. And in that case, we would bring in partners or work specifically on that particular program. Yeah.
I think the question coming in again, I have two of them here again, even though I kind of think you've answered it all, you have answered it, but just to be very, very clear for people, you're saying that if something is grant aided as regards re-wetting a bog or planting forestry, something that captures carbon, that they cannot sell those credits.
No. Did we say that?
Cannot get paid for those credits again.
I think I was saying in relation to the forestry, I think that's the policy. Again, this is a new space, so it's not determined. But I think, as I said, the farming, the policy indicates a PPP, public-private partnership approach. And as I said, we would envisage, because the credits actually wouldn't be huge, So I think to make it worthwhile, it should be a combination of private and or improved land use options from an environmental perspective. But again, I'm not writing the policy. We're just here to try things out, get the information, and then feed into that what we learn. So I wouldn't. I don't have my tea leaves here, so. But I think we'll see how it goes.
Evan might have his crystal ball, or maybe he doesn't need it. Evan, have you?
No, sorry. Padraig, I just, if it's okay, I accidentally clicked the button in the quick question and answers, and I don't want to offend anybody. There was a woman who had asked a question on what are the 4 pillars of carbon farming, and in my effort to answer, I made a mistake there. So just to let whoever that person was know that they're agroforestry, peatland restoration, mineral soil regeneration, and livestock carbon auditing. And there's also the question of whether energy on farm will be included in the audit. And I would just want to make the point that would be very interesting, and that an Irish approach might look at that specifically, because SECs, rurally led SECs, would be viable for the RECC, the RESS, the Renewable Energy Supply Scheme's Section 8 community tranche disbursement. And that could be quite a significant strategic development for rural renewable energy in Ireland also.
You're on a roll, Evan. So you were also asked for the EU publication link for setting up and implementing that you mentioned in there. So if you could make that available to us, we'd share it with the listeners as well.
Would they be able to get all of these questions and answer them via some other?
We'll make them available to you. Yeah, that'd be super.
That'd be brilliant. Just to get them all answered.
After
questions, and we'd be very happy to have them.
Okay, listen, I think we're going to have to, we've hit our timeline, so we're going to have to call a halt there. I think the one conclusion you would have to draw is there's a huge amount of questions to be answered that we don't yet have the answers to. And it's going to be a process of learning. And I think that's what the projects that you're undertaking are all about. It's about learning about the practical elements and the economics and the verification. So a huge amount of learning, but I don't think you could underestimate the importance of the work you're doing. And you talked about 10 million tons, just to put that in context, like that's half the agricultural emissions of approximately 20 million tons. So that's the amount that's at stake in this space. So it is huge. And you also mentioned that this comes into the reckoning. It's not really being counted at the moment, but it comes into the reckoning later in this decade. And then that's when it will really, really become important. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yeah, 4 years.
I think we will need you back again to deal with maybe specific topics. And in particular, I think maybe the notion of what the implementation at farm level might look like. And that's something I think maybe we will have you back sooner rather than later to start looking at as you get your project up and running. So thank you again, Douglas and Evan. Really appreciated it. As I say, it's going to be an area of huge importance going forward. At this point, I'd like to thank our production team, Amanda Boland and Yvonne Marr. Next week, we have Dr. David Stiles of UL looking at the implications of climate neutrality for agricultural land use and forestry in Ireland. So it's a follow-on topic, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. So thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy your weekend. Goodbye.
Very good.